Spring, 1945. A narrow road cuts through the rolling fields of central Germany, once quiet countryside, now marked by the slow, uneven footsteps of war's final survivors. A column of German women moves along its edges, civilians with dust-coated suitcases, Red Cross nurses in faded uniforms, and auxiliary signal operators clutching the remnants of their assignments. Every face is pale with exhaustion. Every breath carries the weight of a collapsing world. The air is still except for the low rumble of approaching engines. An American patrol truck rolls into view, brakes grinding softly as it stops across the road. The soldiers step out carefully, boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. They raise their hands, not in aggression, but in practiced control. The women halt. Some freeze, others glance at each other, searching for cues in an unfamiliar silence. A nurse's hands tremble as she hides her service badge in her coat pocket. No one speaks at first. Even the birds seem to hold their breath. The war is ending, but no one here knows what the next minutes will bring. And on that lonely road, as both sides confront each other in uneasy quiet, by early 1945, Germany was not simply losing the war, it was unraveling from within. Entire regions lay in ruins, major cities reduced to hollow shells, and the machinery of the Reich no longer functioned in any unified form. The Eastern Front had collapsed under the weight of Soviet advances, and millions of civilians fled westward in desperate, chaotic streams. Among them were German women of every background, factory laborers turned refugees, Red Cross nurses pulled from overrun field stations, and female auxiliaries, the Nachrichtenhelferin, communication and signals personnel, evacuating their posts as command structures disintegrated around them. The roads leading west became slow-moving corridors of exhaustion. Wagons creaked under the weight of belongings that no longer held meaning. Mothers carried children half asleep from hunger. Young auxiliaries walked in silence, hiding the insignia that once represented duty but now represented fear. Rumors spread quickly, stories of harsh reprisals, stories of uncertain treatment, stories of screenings that could define a woman's fate within minutes. Few knew what was true, but all understood that surrender was inevitable. As the Western Allies widened their advance through central Germany, the encounters became routine. American and British units were tasked with processing large groups of surrendering civilians and auxiliary personnel. Protocols were clear. Women were first disarmed, though most carried nothing more than small personal knives or service tools. They were then gathered, questioned, and screened for identification, with Allied intelligence searching for potential SS affiliations, signals operators, or individuals linked to Nazi command networks. To the soldiers, these were standardized procedures. To the women, they were moments suspended between terror and resignation. Many had spent the final months of the war under continuous air raids, shortages, and displacement. Some had witnessed atrocities, others were simply trying to survive with fragments of dignity intact. Their reactions during surrender reflected this cumulative trauma. Some broke down at the sight of Allied uniforms, convinced the worst would follow. Others offered automatic, rigid compliance, as though clinging to the remnants of military structure might protect them. A few maintained an outward calm that barely masked the fear beneath. Yet, amid the tension, many were struck by the contrast between expectation and reality. The soldiers processing them were young, tired, and focused on procedure rather than punishment. Their questions were direct, their movements efficient. They followed standardized orders, not personal grudges. But for the women facing them, each gesture still carried enormous weight. The road where these two worlds met, defeated Germany and advancing Allied forces, became the setting for countless small human confrontations, each shaped by uncertainty and the residue of a collapsing nation. And as these initial encounters spread across the countryside, the deeper context of how the Allies approached mass surrenders began to take shape. As American and British forces pressed deeper into central Germany, their operations evolved from rapid offensive maneuvers to a complex mixture of combat, occupation, and civilian management. The front lines were no longer clearly defined. Scattered resistance existed, but far more common were small, disorganized groups seeking surrender, soldiers, older folksterm members, and increasingly, women who had served in auxiliary roles or who had been swept into the administrative machinery of the Reich. To handle this immense human flow, the Allies relied on established systems. Infantry patrols conducted the first contact, securing roads, rail stations, and villages. Their orders were consistent: disarm, separate groups by category, and move them to a safer location for processing. Once initial control was established, the task shifted to military police, MPs, and counterintelligence corps, CIC, personnel. These units were responsible for screening individuals, verifying identities, and identifying members of the SS, Gestapo, or other organizations subject to immediate detention. For German women, these procedures could be deeply intimidating. Many expected hostile treatment. Months of propaganda had instilled fear of what would happen if the Allies captured them. Stories circulated in bomb shelters and refugee camps, painting a grim picture of what awaited on the other side. In reality, Allied procedures were controlled, bureaucratic, and focused on eliminating potential threats rather than exacting revenge. Most women were instructed to stand in line, hands visible, while soldiers checked their papers, asked questions, and searched backpacks or satchels for weapons, insignia, or forbidden materials. The process was systematic, often conducted outdoors or in commandeered school buildings. The priority was efficiency. There were simply too many people moving across the landscape for lengthy investigations at every stop. But even with structure, the psychological climate on both sides influenced every moment. Allied soldiers approached these encounters with caution, shaped by years of battle and loss. Some had seen units marked as non-combatants suddenly open fire. Others had witnessed atrocities revealed during liberation operations. They did not know who among the approaching women might be hiding affiliation with radical organizations. The women, in turn, carried the weight of collapsing roles and identities. Those who had human angle. For the German women caught in the final collapse of the Reich, surrender was not a single event but an emotional rupture. Many had lived through months of air raids, shortages, and constant propaganda warning them of the dangers of Allied capture. Rumors had taken on a life of their own, claims of retaliation, forced labor, or retribution for the regime's crimes. As they approached Allied lines, these fears mixed with an overwhelming exhaustion that left them vulnerable and shaken. The familiar world, uniforms, duties, routines, was dissolving in real time. Some women clutched personal items as anchors, while others hid service badges or insignia as if erasing pieces of their identity could protect them. The uncertainty of what awaited on the other side magnified every gesture from Allied soldiers. A raised hand, a firm command, or even a simple request to line up could trigger tears, trembling, or complete emotional collapse. Their surrender was not just physical but psychological, the moment they understood that everything they knew had ended. Tactical/procedural angle. For Allied soldiers, encounters with surrendering groups, including women, were guided by strict procedures developed through years of unpredictable frontline experience. Patrols were instructed to halt columns, secure the area, and maintain distance until assessing whether any threat remained. Even seemingly harmless groups required caution. Allied units had repeatedly faced ambushes disguised as surrenders earlier in the war. Once safety was established, military police and intelligence personnel followed a standardized process: disarmament, separation by category, identification checks, and questioning. Women who had served in auxiliary roles were treated as potential intelligence sources, not combatants, but their documents and uniforms were still scrutinized carefully. The priority was clarity, determining who posed a risk, who carried sensitive information, and who needed further investigation. To the soldiers, these were practiced routines designed to keep order amid chaos. To the women subjected to them, the procedures often felt like judgment and exposure, heightening their already fragile emotional state. The tactical need for discipline shaped every interaction. Enemy perception angle. When Allied troops first encountered columns of German women, their reactions were filtered through years of propaganda, battlefield losses, and the brutal realities of occupation. Many soldiers had expected hostility, especially after liberating towns scarred by forced labor camps and witnessing the remnants of Nazi control. Yet what they found was often starkly different: young auxiliaries barely older than themselves, middle-aged women carrying children, and nurses still wearing armbands stained from field hospital work. Some soldiers saw them simply as civilians caught in a collapsing regime, others could not easily separate any uniform, even a communication operator's, from the machinery of the war they had fought. The disconnect between expectation and reality created moments of hesitation. The enemy they had trained to defeat now stood before them in exhaustion, fear, and vulnerability. That shift in perception affected how commands were delivered, how instructions were understood, and how both sides navigated the fragile minutes of surrender. It was in these first impressions that the emotional weight of the wider collapse became most visible. Moral angle. The encounters between Allied troops and surrendering German women carried moral weight that neither side could escape. For the Allies, the responsibility was twofold: maintain security while upholding the principles they claimed to fight for. The collapse of the Reich had revealed evidence of forced labor, mass displacement, and systematic brutality, leaving soldiers with complex emotions as they faced individuals who had served within the regime's structure, even if only in administrative or auxiliary roles. For the women, the moral landscape was equally complicated. Some had been willing participants in the wartime apparatus, others had been swept into it out of necessity or compulsion. Many now confronted the uncomfortable reality that the end of the war meant not only survival, but also accountability. The screenings, though procedural, often forced women to confront the moral consequences of their affiliations, however limited. The line between victim, bystander, and participant blurred in these moments, giving the surrender scenes a quiet gravity that lingered long after the questioning ended. Psychological angle. The psychological shock among German women during surrender was profound. For years, the regime had offered structure, identity, and a clearly defined sense of belonging. Whether through auxiliary service, factory work, or civil roles, many had placed their lives into systems now collapsing around them. The sudden loss of that framework created a void that could be felt in every interaction with Allied forces. Many experienced dissociation, a numbing disconnect from the reality unfolding before them. Others swung between panic and resignation, unable to predict whether the next instruction meant safety or danger. Even simple commands, delivered firmly but without malice, could trigger tears or trembling. The sight of uniforms, once symbols of order, now represented their defeated world. The moment of surrender forced them to acknowledge that everything stable had dissolved, and that the future would be shaped by forces entirely outside. The line of women stood quietly in the open yard of a requisitioned schoolhouse, their shoes sinking slightly into soft spring mud. The Allies had chosen the location for its space and visibility, a place where procedures could be followed cleanly and with minimal confusion. Military police moved with practiced rhythm, separating civilians from auxiliaries, tagging luggage, and directing individuals toward folding tables where CIC personnel sat with stacks of forms and captured documents. The air held the muted tension of an encounter neither side wished for, yet both were compelled to endure. One group of women, mostly former communications assistants and clerical workers, waited near the wall of the building. Among them, a young auxiliary clutched a canvas satchel fixed tightly to her chest. Inside were the last remnants of her service, a signals badge, a diary, and a small insignia she had removed from her uniform earlier that morning. When an American MP approached and asked her to step forward, her grip tightened instinctively. She hesitated, unsure whether to comply or conceal. Her reaction drew the soldier's attention, not suspicion, but caution. He motioned to her gently, indicating the satchel. She shook her head at first, then slowly loosened her grasp. Before taking it, the MP spoke in slow, clear English, not unkind, but firm enough to prevent misunderstanding. It was a simple instruction he had issued many times that week. Close your eyes. The command was procedural. Allied soldiers often used it when removing personal items, searching belongings, or handling objects that could provoke distress. It prevented sudden movements, reduced tension, and helped ensure that nothing in the woman's possession, insignia, sharp objects, or sensitive documents, created a moment of panic. But to the women hearing it, the phrase carried a weight far beyond its intent. They did not understand the nuances of Allied security protocol. They heard instead an order filled with fear and uncertainty. The auxiliary obeyed, eyelids trembling as she turned her face slightly away. The soldier opened the satchel carefully. Inside, the insignia glinted under the pale light, small, tarnished, yet unmistakably tied to the uniform she had abandoned. He held it up briefly to the officer behind the table, who nodded once in confirmation. It was not an SS emblem, not a mark of elite affiliation, but it was still part of the collapsed structure the Allies were dismantling piece by piece. The MP set the badge aside along with several similar items gathered that day. Some would be catalogued, others destroyed. To the women who owned them, these objects had shaped identity for years. To the soldiers, they were symbols that needed to be removed for the safety and order of occupation. When the MP finally said, "You can open your eyes," the young woman saw the empty space where her badge had been. Her breath caught slightly, not because of punishment, but because a part of her wartime life had been taken out of her hands forever. It was a small, quiet moment, yet one that captured the emotional rupture unfolding across Germany. And it was in such moments, repeated at countless checkpoints and screening stations, that the deeper human breaking point of surrender became fully visible. When the young auxiliary lowered her gaze to the empty table, the meaning of what had happened settled slowly over her. The confiscation of a small badge was not a punishment, the Allies had no interest in humiliating her, but the act itself signaled an irreversible truth: the structure she had served, the identity she had carried, and the sense of belonging she once felt had vanished. Around her, similar moments unfolded with the same quiet intensity. At another table, a former Red Cross nurse trembled as officers examined her papers. Months earlier, she had worked in a field station overwhelmed by casualties. Now, stripped of her armband and instructed to stand still, she felt the final collapse of the role that had given her purpose. When told she was free to go, she broke into unexpected tears, not from fear, but from release. The war had demanded constant endurance, its ending demanded something different, something she had not yet learned how to give herself, permission to stop. Nearby, a middle-aged civilian woman clutched her identification card so tightly her fingers whitened. When a CIC officer informed her that her town had already surrendered days earlier, she sank to her knees, overwhelmed not by threat, but by the shock of certainty. She had been walking west for 2 weeks, convinced that moving one step farther might change her fate. The realization that her journey had ended, that the war had overtaken her regardless, left her momentarily unable to speak. There were women who reacted with silence. Others shook uncontrollably, not from cold but from the sudden removal of fear's constant pressure. A few confessed affiliations no one had asked about, spilling details of clerical assignments, small tasks, or names of supervisors, not because the Allies demanded it, but because they were desperate to unburden themselves, to prove innocence, or simply to fill the unbearable quiet with something they could control. Once the screenings and initial processing were complete, the women were guided toward temporary holding areas. These spaces varied, commandeered school halls, barns, and open fields, but all were organized to allow the Allies to maintain control while attending to basic necessities. The first priority was assessment. Soldiers and MPs conducted quick medical checks, offering water, bread, and basic hygiene wherever possible. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and minor injuries were common. Many women had walked for days without rest or proper food. CIC officers and military police classified individuals according to affiliation and perceived risk. Women who had served in communications, transportation, or administrative units were separated from civilians but not treated as combatants. Identification papers were verified, personal effects documented, and suspicious items catalogued. For the women, the procedures were often bewildering yet increasingly familiar. Repetitive instructions and visible organization began to replace the terror of earlier encounters. The pace remained brisk. Thousands needed to move through these processing points before advancing units could continue their push into central Germany. Allied soldiers, initially cautious and sometimes tense, gradually adjusted their demeanor once order was established. Many offered small gestures of reassurance, a hand to guide someone forward, a nod, or quiet explanations. Some documented testimonies describe women noticing moments of unexpected humanity, a soldier helping a frail woman adjust her coat, another offering water to a child on a mother's lap. These small acts did not erase the trauma but underscored the procedural and measured nature of the surrender process. Even in these controlled circumstances, emotional fragility was evident. Women wept quietly as they sat on benches, others remained frozen in shock. Occasionally, officers had to pause to allow someone to regain composure before moving forward. Recorded accounts from both German and Allied sources indicate that many women spoke of relief mixed with disbelief, a profound sense that survival did not guarantee understanding or closure. The immediate aftermath established patterns that would persist for weeks. Women were sorted, fed, and rested, but the psychological imprint of the day's events remained. By the time the holding areas emptied into larger transport operations, the initial chaos of surrender had given way to a controlled system, yet the echoes of fear, relief, and loss lingered. From these first hours of structured processing, the trajectory of the post-surrender period began to take shape, one that would extend into months of displacement, camps, and eventual return to a transformed Germany. In the months that followed, the women who had surrendered were moved from temporary holding areas into larger displacement camps and internment facilities. These sites, often repurposed military barracks or former schools, were designed to accommodate thousands at a time. Conditions were basic: shared sleeping quarters, limited sanitation, and structured meal schedules. Yet compared with the exhaustion and fear of the immediate surrender, these spaces offered a semblance of stability. Medical care continued, and records of each individual's wartime role were carefully maintained, ensuring that women could be processed appropriately and, when cleared, eventually released. For many, the journey back to civilian life was slow and uncertain. Transportation networks had been destroyed, entire towns lay in ruins. Women often returned to villages unfamiliar to them, or towns they had fled months earlier now occupied by Allied forces. Some were reunited with family, while others discovered that their homes had been lost or that loved ones had perished in bombings or fighting. The psychological weight of these losses compounded the trauma of surrender. Survivors spoke in later testimonies of feelings of dislocation, guilt, and a fragile hope that the war's end might allow reconstruction, both of cities and personal lives. Historians note that these experiences left enduring emotional scars. The act of surrender, once a singular moment, became intertwined with months of uncertainty, bureaucratic processing, and exposure to Allied authority. Women who had faced collapse on the road, or during screenings, carried memories of trembling hands, confiscated insignia, and the sudden dissolving of wartime identity. For many, the relief of survival was inseparable from grief for the world they had lost. These encounters also shaped post-war interpretations of civilian and auxiliary involvement in the Reich. Scholars emphasize the importance of understanding surrender not as a single event, but as a sequence of human experiences influenced by exhaustion, fear, and systemic processing. The reactions of these women, tears, silence, confessions, or fainting, provide insight into the human consequences of collapse, revealing how procedures intended to establish order intersected with profound psychological vulnerability. By the end of 1945, war is often measured in battles, casualties, and territorial shifts, yet its true weight is carried in moments of quiet human fragility. In the final days of the Reich, surrender was not announced with trumpets or fanfare, but whispered along muddy roads, spoken in the trembling voices of women unsure of what lay ahead. A single command, "Close your eyes," became emblematic of this subtle, profound collapse. It was procedural, mundane even, but for those who obeyed, it symbolized the dissolution of identity, duty, and the world they had known. These women were not combatants in the traditional sense, yet they bore the accumulated fear, exhaustion, and moral ambiguity of a nation in collapse. Their tears, their silence, and their confessions revealed the hidden human cost of war, the internal battles that are seldom recorded in official histories, but which linger in the memory of those who survive. The act of surrender, often depicted as a single decisive moment, was in truth a chain of human awakenings, the recognition of defeat, the relinquishing of control, and the first fragile steps toward a life beyond conflict. In reflecting on these moments, we see that history is composed not only of strategies and tactics, but of countless small human encounters, each carrying its own weight. "Close your eyes" was more than an order, it was a pause in the chaos, a lens into the quiet collapse of an empire, and a reminder that even in the vast machinery of war, the human spirit, vulnerable, exhausted, yet enduring, remains central to the story. It is here, in the intersection of procedure and humanity, that the echoes of 1940